Welcome everybody, it's so nice to see you all here today. My name's Alison McKenna. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist from Southeastern Trust's Regional Trauma Network. And thank you for completing the poll as you signed in. This allows us to see how far and wide we're reaching. This is the second of our series of 6 Lunch and Learns, all focused on the Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland's Trauma-Informed Organisational Toolkit. In today's session, we'll be covering 2 of the 10 focus areas, namely learning and development and workforce well-being. All the forthcoming 4 sessions after today will take place fortnightly using the very same Zoom link you used to log in today. This session is recorded and will be uploaded to the playlist on YouTube after today. Your mics have been deactivated, but we will take questions at the end. This session is just a brief introduction and will last 40 minutes, as is the case with all Lunch and Learn sessions. If you would like to receive a copy of the slides, a link to the recording, a certificate for CPD hours, and any other resources we may have, please enter your details in the window which is appearing on your screen now. Just a note that we need your name and your email. Please note that we cannot send you the resources without both. We are only permitted to issue certificates to those who entered their details by 1:10. We value your feedback, so please answer the polls that come up at various intervals. Please note that most of the polls, except the one at the very end, are just tick box, so shouldn't take a moment to complete. And today's session, like all the other Lunch and Learn sessions, has been co-designed and co-delivered by Health and Social Care and the Victims and Survivors Service. And in this case, we have a further partnership with Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland, whose toolkit we'll be focusing on. And today's presenters are Orla Connolly from Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland and Joanne Manari from Southern Trust.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Orla Connolly. I'm one of the implementation managers in the Trauma Informed Practice team, which sits within the Safeguarding Board. So I'm a social worker by background who has worked primarily within the health service.
Welcome everybody. My name is Joanne Manari. So I'm a consultant clinical psychologist for children and young people with the Regional Trauma Network in the Southern Health and Social Care Trust.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of insight in terms of the toolkit, and again thinking about just that reminder as to what we talked about on our previous session, that the toolkit is an organisational framework, really looking at there are 10 focus areas, and these are really designed to help organisations reflect on current practices, highlight successes, and identify areas for further development. So we're talking about learning and development today. We're talking about workforce well-being. These are 2 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of thinking about, all those elements of what it means to be a trauma-informed organisation. So when we think about this in terms of, learning and development is closely interlinked with workforce well-being, as it supports staff to acknowledge the impact work can have. And when we're talking about workforce training, this is generally regarded as the foundation for effective delivery of trauma-informed services, or the first step for an organisation becoming trauma-informed. And it's also important to say that, before any training is rolled out, including trauma training, we really need to be mindful and understand whether staff have the appropriate conditions and support in place to then begin to apply any new knowledge and skills. So we spoke a little bit in our last webinar really about the Northern Ireland specific research, which was launched by Queen's University last year. And really what this research was saying was that they recommend trauma-informed approach training for all staff. They were recognising that training alone, especially when it's short and one-off, that's insufficient to embed lasting practice change. One of the recommendations we mentioned the last day was that Queen's recommended that a regional training framework should be developed. And this would help to really differentiate between trauma-informed and trauma-focused service provision. So a training framework, if it were developed within Northern Ireland, it would enable organisation to progress workforce development and support strategies really commensurate with that staff member's role and responsibility. And what you'll see on this next slide here is an extract from the SBNI training brochure, and it's really modelled on the Scottish training framework. And what this does, it talks about that there are different levels, that different staff will need different levels of training in relation to trauma. So for example, my background is in social work, and the Scottish framework would say that a social worker would be deemed to be needed trained to that level 3 trauma enhanced level. And you'll see there that that's staff who have a specific remit to respond by providing support, advocacy, or specific psychological interventions, or those who have directly managing care or services for those affected by trauma. And this guidance really is something that can help people really layer up their understanding of the impact and the imprint of trauma, and really thinking about what do we need to know at the different levels according to our role and responsibility. So the other things on the next slide, what you'll see is that the Queen's research, what it was saying was that they wanted trauma-informed training to be embedded across all professional programmes within Northern Ireland. There was a recommendation that we work towards a dedicated rolling trauma-informed leadership programme. They wanted staff to be active participants in their training, and really encouraging staff to express the challenges and systemic barriers that they experienced. The research also highlighted some common elements in relation to thinking about learning and development and workforce development. And what they were saying was what we've already said, that there's a need for ongoing training in relation to trauma. There was a sense that they felt that training should be delivered to a variety of staff at all levels of the organisation. They were looking at the importance of practical learning elements, peer workers and staff with lived experience being involved in the training delivery, that training to be in partnership with leadership. And this concept, which also links to our topic of workforce wellbeing, having space and time for staff to debrief and discuss difficulties on a regular basis. And they were really talking about the importance of having training on trauma embedded into induction programs for new staff, and that there was compulsory training. Now, SAMHSA also talks about, this is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, which provides frameworks on implementing a trauma-informed approach. They talk about as well the need for ongoing training, focusing on the impact of trauma, trauma-informed principles and focus areas, and really thinking about, the importance of embedding those 6 principles and having strategies to really deal with secondary traumatic stress. So again, these concepts of layering up our understanding of trauma and the importance of thinking about that. So the SAMHSA guidance on the next slide, what you'll see is there's also a focus on preventing secondary traumatic stress in staff, that we're supporting staff to understand and recognise secondary traumatic stress, and that people have, the opportunity to explore their own experiences with trauma, especially the ways in which trauma impacts their work. They talk about the focus on really needing to think about the health and well-being of staff, trying to avoid high caseloads, demanding hours, and really the importance of providing trauma-informed reflective spaces, debrief and clinical supervision were indicated. So it's all about thinking about how do we enhance knowledge, skills, and confidence of staff. So how do we support our staff to identify what are their own training needs? How do we prioritise those most in need of trauma training? And really, I just wanted to touch on this point of training staff to deal with traumatic disclosures. So I'm conscious a number of people on the call who are clinicians, and what this the research from Queen's was saying, some staff didn't feel prepared or qualified. They were afraid to open a can of worms, and they felt they needed a clear protocol on how to respond to feel confident that the system will respond appropriately by providing effective and accessible therapeutic services. So, despite varying perspectives about when to screen for trauma, there was a sense that consensus is building that we need ample training for staff to proceed any screening, and professionals should be supported to feel confident and proficient in trauma screening and conducting appropriate follow-up discussions. You'll see a resource there at the bottom that talks to this area, which is important. So these are some. On the next slide, you'll see some resources that really support staff to link research to practice. So there's various bodies that strive to bridge the gap between research and practice, and you can read some of those in your own time. So Joanne is now going to kind of look at some examples in relation to learning and development. And what you'll see there is just on that final slide is looking at the extract from the toolkit, which really looks at that checklist to ask people to look at their baseline in terms of where their organisation's at in terms of learning and development. So what I'll do now is pass over to Joanne in terms of looking at some examples in relation to this.
Thank you, Orla. Thank you for joining us today. We know that this is over lunchtime, so we very much appreciate everybody who's on the call today, and there is the recording if you're not able to stay right to the end. So Orla has provided an overview of learning and development focus area. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some examples of how organisations have embedded these approaches into practice. Now, we appreciate that this is just a whistle-stop tour and we cannot cover all of the many great examples, and some of which you can read more about in the resource section of the toolkit. But hopefully from today, you'll take some ideas away. So if we're thinking about learning and development, we know that supporting staff to keep up to date with relevant and emerging research can present a challenge, especially in light of pressures that many departments and teams are facing. So why does learning and development matter, and why have we thought about introducing this focus area as one of the first of the series of the Lunch and Learn events? Well, as Orla mentioned, the research has shown that workforce training has been identified as foundational for an organisation to become trauma-informed, and as a way to facilitate that embedding of trauma-informed approaches. So as Orla mentioned, trauma-informed approach training really is to increase the knowledge of the workforce and understanding that everyone can play a part in providing helpful experiences during their interactions and engagements with staff and service users. So although we don't have a training pathway in Northern Ireland like they do in Scotland, you can see from the slide that the SBNI have developed a training brochure which contains links to a range of training modules at different levels. And this is to support organisations' understanding of the impact of stress and adversity and trauma. And these are available for all workforces across Northern Ireland. So if you haven't already done so, we would recommend engaging or reviewing the trainings prior to completing the toolkit checklist. So the tool that you see on your screens now, this provides practical tips as a guide for trainers when designing and delivering both in-person and virtual training. Training is delivered in all organisations at all levels to service users and to staff. So this resource was developed by the Southern Health Trust Social Work Learning and Development Team and the Trauma Network. And this product was produced really in answer to the question and the wonderings as to how do we know that the training we deliver to staff is actually trauma informed. And there isn't clear guidance out there. So the toolkit then was developed to help support staff who are developing trainings both virtually and for in person. So the toolkit alongside this supports organisations to embed these approaches across policy and practice with the goal being whole system organisational change. But we do know that everything can't be achieved at once, and becoming a trauma-informed organisation is a journey. So one of the messages that come out of the Queen's research that we're on a journey is that by making a small start somewhere, we can then build on these foundations and cascade that learning. And we also recognise that none of us are coming from a blank slate. This tool is also an important guide to support us to recognise what we're already doing and why we're doing it, as well as a prompt to think about other small changes that could maybe have a big impact. So this tool is applicable for all services, and it's an example to think about from a trauma-informed lens when designing and delivering in-person training. As I said, there is one for virtual as well, but we've just put this example up today, and you can access all of these on the toolkit resource section. So the tool's divided into the lens concept that some of you may be familiar with. And thinking about things we need to look for and think about prior to the training, things we might need to explore during the training, and what are the needs of participants, and how can trainers, teams and organisations provide support. So the lens has an accompanying document that explains each area in more detail. Now, training is an important concept as a foundational step to embedding trauma-informed approaches, and through this lens, you will find 6 principles of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment and inclusion. So when staff are attending training, we want them to feel safe, to be able to trust in the trainer, and that the content is evidence-based, that they will be supported to embed the training within their practice, and that staff feel that they have a choice as to whether this is the right time for them to attend training, recognising that we don't always know what people may be experiencing. And also that staff feel it's a collaborative process for non-mandatory training, and also that staff understand the rationale for those trainings that are mandatory. So that there is collaboration and opportunities for discussion and feedback during the training, and that all staff should feel included and empowered, skilled and valued. So really, when we're thinking about these 4 areas in terms of our stress response system and how stress affects our brain and body and our learning styles, stress can push us outside of our window of tolerance, and that makes it harder for us to learn, to regulate, to retrieve and retain any information. However, when participants at trainings feel safe, this can impact on how they engage with others, making it easier to regulate, to learn and engage with the training. So the purpose of this tool really is to address any barriers that people affected by stress, adversity and trauma can experience, and support them to remain within their own window of tolerance. So it's back to Orla now, who's going to give us a bit more of an overview regarding workforce wellbeing.
Okay, thank you, Joanne, for that. So this focus area of thinking about workforce wellbeing, essentially what we're talking about here is, you know, the importance of stress. People can find it difficult to regulate stress people. So what we want to do is really thinking about how do we support our organisations to prioritise the well-being of staff. How do we ensure staff have a sense of permission to really talk about the impact of the work? How do we think about those context and situational factors that can really contribute to those workforce challenges? So workforce wellbeing is really thinking about the importance of the relational environment. It's thinking about psychological safety in the workplace, not just feeling physically safe, but psychologically safe. And how do we really make sure that there is a proportionate focus within our organisations, our teams, and our services on organisational care rather than a sole focus on self care? Because we need to understand that unresolved trauma in the workforce can really impact at many different levels. And therefore, we need to really think about the importance of building in scheduled time for reflection and debriefs. We need to support our workforce and our organisations to really think about responding to burnout, vicarious trauma, moral injury, distress, and making sure that we have those effective support structures in place, particularly for those people, who are regularly supporting individuals who have been impacted by trauma and mental health difficulties. So what you'll see on this next slide about the QUB research, whereby we had a number of organisations across Northern Ireland participate in this, and the theme really was really clear that secondary or vicarious trauma among frontline staff needs to be properly addressed. The research really highlighted the importance of a supportive staff culture and that whole team approach. And it talks about we can't let staff or members being left to sink or struggle alone. And this is quote here to see the full onus on individual staff members to support their well-being in light of the known effects of secondary trauma is not sufficient. And you'll see from the next slide, they were also talking about the importance in the research of regular support, reflection activities. So team meetings, communication, celebration activities, that these were all critical in terms of keeping the learning from initial trainings alive. They talked about the importance of thinking about how do we have a trauma-informed approach seep into the workplace culture and create that collective vision. So on this next slide, just a couple of quotes that I thought was important just to touch on today and to really thinking about the importance of a trauma-informed service setting itself is as vulnerable to the effects of trauma, chronic stress and adversity as the patients or client they treat. So if we want to have trauma-informed organisations, we need to be considering both the organisation and the clients as well. And I think this quote in green there, where it really talks about exhaustion, burnout and deteriorating mental health are among the greatest challenges. It talks about toxic workplaces can cause trauma, and where there is unfairness, unrelenting criticism, or other forms of unpredictability, it can cause feelings of trauma. So workplace traumas can shake people to their core. And so it's this message of, whether or not someone has a history of trauma, for many of us who are working in the front line, bearing witness to human suffering and adversity, this can be deeply impactful. So again, it's really talking about naming, acknowledging and exploring the impact of all those things that we just touched on. And that's a resource from Karen Treisman, some of you might find useful, because it really focuses on a spotlight on organisational trauma, the system as client. So on the next slide, you'll see just this, conversation, around, say, burnout. Burnout's often a symptom of workplace stress that has not been successfully addressed. And organisations, Mandy Davis has said to us, they have a responsibility to mitigate, vicarious trauma. It's a requirement. It's not an afterthought. So we're trying to look at how do we introduce all this language. Moral injury is when an organisational actions do not align with a person's values. And we know some of the challenges, and you'll see there in terms of some of the pressures our systems are under. And when we do have increased demands and expectations, staff who are physically and emotionally exhausted, burnout, deteriorating mental health, we can see the catch-22 situation that presents in many of our teams and services. But really thinking about these conversations, we need to be thinking about psychological safety in our teams. We need to be thinking about team morale, team cohesion. Where is our team on this scale? Do we, feel, do we have a toxic, kind of unsafe environment where people hold back from voicing concerns? They fear what they might say might be used against them. Or do we have a psychologically safe environment where we can challenge things without fear of criticism? So again, it's thinking about these concepts when we're thinking about workforce well-being. How do we introduce these concepts such as psychological safety, co-regulation, relationships matter? And just to finish, I think this quote about we all need a village, we all need people we can confide in, fall apart with, ask for help, and air out our insecurities and shame. This doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. And I think that's so important because it's normal and healthy to need other people. We need really to think about the importance of supporting our workforce. So when we're thinking about becoming a trauma-informed organisation, workforce wellbeing is absolutely core. It is absolutely foundational. And this organisational care is absolutely fundamental when we think about this. And just that last slide there is just really summarising from the checklist, the workforce wellbeing kind of aspects that we invite team services and organisations to consider when they are thinking about where they are at within their particular team. So I'll hand back to Joanne now just to think about some examples of this in practice.
Thank you, Orla. So as you mentioned, learning and development is closely interlinked with workforce well-being as it supports our staff to acknowledge the impact of the work. So just a few examples. So thinking about staff and from an organisational perspective, when staff feel they have a say in what happens, they feel listened to and valued, physically and psychologically safe. This will have a positive effect on productivity, on creativity, and the quality of the service received by service users. So when we are thinking about staff well-being, we're thinking about ways we can promote meaningful connections and safe spaces in the workplace. So we're going to show a short video now as to why we have focused on staff well-being. Thank you, Alison. So that's just a lovely little clip. Just to show the importance of taking care of others means that we also need to take care of ourselves as well. And with the increasing recognition of secondary or vicarious trauma, self-care is an important element. So in the next slide, in the next slide, where you can access this tool on the SBNI's Toolkit. And again, we're thinking about how can we support staff to support themselves with different self-care and regulation strategies. And this is a lovely tool that staff can do themselves, and it's thinking about our personal and professional lives, and across a number of different domains we can rate how we would see ourselves in terms of our work, our sleep, our emotional and psychological, our physical and mental health, our leisure, our compassion and spirituality. And it's just a few reflective questions then that can help us to think about, is there any changes we would like to make, both personally, professionally, or both? So moving on to the next slide, Alison, then we have the unlock and reflect model. And sometimes we may have concerns in the workplace that may not always feel that they are in our control. So we're also thinking about ways not only can staff support themselves, but how can the system support staff as well. And employers are also responsible for ensuring that staff are provided with resources and environments to be able to perform their roles.
Supervision can sometimes feel stressful and even like a test, especially when you're managing challenges like dyslexia. In these moments, it can feel hard to communicate all that I know and to stay calm and focused.
Hi Colin, can you tell me what skills you used today?
What did he ask me? Skills? What skills? What am I even doing here? Oh, he thinks I'm stupid. Growing up with dyslexia, I often felt misunderstood in school, where traditional learning methods didn't work well for me. So this unlock and reflect tool helps me in the window of tolerance, where I'm calm and focused. It's tactile, helping me process information without feeling overwhelmed.
I started working with Colleen. I observed that she would panic when I asked particularly about theory and legislation. Therefore, having a basic understanding of neuroscience from Dr. Daniel Siegel's hand model of the brain and knowledge of trauma-informed supervision, I was able to apply this to help inform my assessment that when I was asking Colleen questions that required a deeper level of recall, she was thinking more with her amygdala, therefore effectively flipping her lid and going into a state of freeze. I encouraged Colleen to develop her own supervision model in the hope that this tactile learning process would help act as an emotional anchor, allowing her to stay within her optimal level of learning zone during supervision. However, this model has been significantly more successful than we originally anticipated. As when Colleen uses this model in supervision, I notice that she appears more confident and is able to articulately apply theory and legislation to her practice. This process of creating the model and using this in supervision has transformed Colleen's experience of supervision, which has led to a deeper, more meaningful learning experience all round. And for this reason, I would highly encourage other practice teachers to consider using the unlock and reflect model.
And that's where unlock and reflect comes in. I designed this as a practical, supportive tool to help me unlock what I know in supervision. It uses movements, which helps me stay grounded and focused. As an aesthetic learner, I find the hands-on tool helps me learn and retain information. When thinking about the window of tolerance theory, I find that the textile function of the model helps me to regulate my emotions when speaking about theory, values and legislation, and avoids my brain becoming overwhelmed when asked questions. All you need is a pen and paper. As you prepare the cases for discussion and supervision, you can adapt the tool to suit any topic you want to address. Leave space for key buzzwords that will help you stay focused. Unlock and reflect has transformed my supervision experience. It's a calming, trauma-informed tool that helps me stay engaged and regulate my emotions so I can focus, concentrate and let information move into my long-term memory.
Colin, thank you for attending supervision today. So this morning we were out to see an elderly gentleman, and can you tell me what skills you used during that interaction?
Yeah, I got this. I ensured I used my active listening skills and with my non-verbal communication skills, and I sat close to him because he's hearing difficulties, so I ensured that he could understand what I was saying. Supervision should be a time of growth and confidence. With Unlock and Reflect, students can bring their best selves forward. Thank you for watching, and I hope this tool can support others as much as it supported me.
Thinking about different ways, different creative ways that we can support supervisees and supervisors within their own window of tolerance. And this same model can be applied to the organisation and to the teams, and to think about creative ways that we can help to support our organisations, our teams and ourselves to bring us back to the green zone when we will inevitably drift in and out with life's challenges. So I'm just going to hand you back to Orla for the final slide.
Right, okay. So
Sorry, I think it's the next one then, Alison.
yeah. So just really to finish, I suppose this is the link to where the toolkit is. You can also download the checklist. There's an interactive version available if anyone wants to download that. The links to the research, there's an executive summary and full report and the training brochure. So there are just some useful links. Certainly you're more than welcome, or anyone is, on those. When you go to the toolkit website, on the SBNI website, you'll get contact details for myself or any of the implementation managers in the trauma informed practice team. So please feel free to get in touch. And again, you know, we're conscious, as Joanne said, these sessions, you know, they're taster sessions. They're just touching on the components of what it means to be a trauma informed organisation. Certainly we're happy to take any questions at the moment in relation to today's topics of thinking about learning and development, or thinking about workforce well-being. But hopefully some of those some of that information today will give people some ideas and some thoughts, and just really reflecting on how do you go back to your team, your organisation and service, and really recognise what is going well, and are there any areas where there might be areas for development that this framework or toolkit might be able to support you with.